Hello, Carmen Gentile. Welcome to the GRN interviews. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. You've been covering Kabul for GRN for the last year or so, over a year. Yeah.
That's true.
Um, Great. So we are sorry that we cannot have you here in London with us, but we are happy to get you in the GRN interviews. Could you just start by telling us a little bit about your career as a journalist? When did you start?
I started my career in the late 90s. I moved to Cairo, Egypt, and started working on a small English language weekly. It was my first foray into overseas reporting. I had been living in Cairo, studying Arabic, and had a little experience working on newspapers before that, and it took off from there. Spent 2 years living and working in Egypt and learned a lot and has been able to build off of that since.
And you have been in Kabul for how long now?
I've been in Afghanistan on this trip just a short time, about a month and a half. I usually stay a little bit longer, 3 to 4 months at a time I spend in country. But this being the winter time, I was in country for a very specific project I'm working on in southern Afghanistan regarding efforts to bring security and stability to that region and how those efforts have panned out.
And you had quite a serious injury last year, which stopped you from working for a while?
Yes, back in September 2010, I was embedded with U.S. troops in eastern Afghanistan in Kunar province near the Pakistani border. And during one foot patrol, I was talking to some young men, and about 40 yards away, a man with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher fired an RPG at me, and it actually struck me in the face, and it blinded me in the eye and fractured and these bones in my face. I've had numerous surgeries to restore my vision partially, and had a number of titanium plates and pins grafted onto my bones to restructure my face.
I must say they've done quite a job on you. It's not visible at all.
I'm very happy about it. I just have a small scar right here, and where I was blind for a number of months, now I can see outside with the help of an artificial lens and some miraculous doctoring on the parts of surgeons in the U.S. and in Afghanistan. I had my first surgery at Bagram Airfield with a military ophthalmologist who, what my doctors in the States told me, saved my eye.
Were you worried before you went back to Afghanistan? Probably most of your friends and family thought this was the end of your journalism career in dangerous places.
Okay. I had spent 8 months recovering after my surgery, numerous surgeries in fact, and once the doctor said I was able to return to work, I went back to Afghanistan, and I was definitely afraid that first troops, and since then, still not apprehensive at times, but it's part of the job.
Do you feel that you're more careful now?
I think I am more careful. I wouldn't say that I was particularly reckless in the past. I think maybe I'm more mindful of my surroundings, which is something that every war correspondent needs to do. There were times when I might have relied on other people's eyes to watch out for me when I was filming or when I was interviewing someone. Now I'm a lot more aware of just about what is happening all around me. So I take that into account when I'm doing my job now.
It seems that there are some places where being a journalist, being visibly a journalist, makes you safer, and some places where it puts you in more danger. Where would you place Afghanistan in that sense?
Depends on the particular climate. I think that in certain situations, you might enjoy a little more safety as compared to soldiers with whom you're embedding. Although in a firefight, it doesn't really matter. Bullets don't really pick a person, they just fly indiscriminately, unfortunately. You know, in this current state of unrest, there are situations, protests, violent altercations where journalists are likely to be possible targets. So these are things you have to particularly keep in mind when you're covering these events.
It was very much on our mind this week following the death of the journalists in Syria. We have a few journalists in Syria that we're quite worried about, and also the Frontline Club handed out this survey to freelance journalists about how they conduct themselves. One of the questions they asked was, is there a story that is worth dying for? I would ask you, is there a story that is worth risking your life for?
I don't think so. I think that in order to be a good storyteller, first and foremost, you have to live to tell the story. And it's imperative that you take your safety into consideration and the safety of the people with whom you're working into consideration. And I think any good war correspondent will tell you that coming home to tell the story is of the utmost importance. There's no story worth dying for, no.
People who work in more organized media as staffers often get training to keep safe in hazardous environment. And I know that these courses are now available also for freelancers, but they're quite expensive. Did you consider doing one of them? Did you do one of them?
I've never taken a course. I have been doing this now, covering conflict for 8 years. And I've been fortunate to have been mentored in the field by experienced correspondents who taught me the ropes as I was doing the job. I wouldn't recommend that strategy for young journalists coming up, but I had that particular opportunity that allowed me to learn on the job. I had my first experience covering conflict in 2004 during the coup in Haiti, when there was just mass killings and violence in the streets, and I was working with some seasoned veterans who taught me to always err on the side of caution, and your safety is the primary concern.
Do you always make sure that you are insured, for example?
Oh, absolutely. It's imperative that you get insurance. Insurance is relatively affordable, and having it has made all the difference for me, I have to say. And having the support of the outlet for which you're working is also important. I think that freelance correspondents need to be upfront and talk to their clients about what would happen in the event that the individual, the correspondent, was injured. I think it's imperative that freelance correspondents talk to their client publications, news agencies, whatever outlet for which they're working, about what would happen in the event of an injury. It's always important to have your own insurance, but you also need to know that the publication for which you're working is going to be there for you if, in fact, you are hurt. I've been fortunate to have the support of the agencies for which I work during my recovery and during my injury. So that's something that I think that news outlets need to be responsible for as well.
So 2011 for you.
My 2011 got off to a little bit of a slow start. I was still recovering from my injury, but I returned to the field in May 2011 and spent 4 months in Afghanistan covering the war from different parts of the country, Kandahar, Helmand, and then in the east in Kunar, Nangarhar, and Paktia province. I spent some time with U.S. Special Forces, which many journalists don't have that opportunity. It's not very often they allow the media to see what they're doing, and that was a particularly interesting time for me. I got to see one of the hardest fought parts of the war in Helmand with the U.S. Marines and what they go through down there. Very eye-opening experience, considering the caliber of the fighters they go up against. That's the Taliban A Squad down in Helmand, and the number of IEDs they have down there, number of injuries and deaths they've sustained. Quite the experience.
Isn't it surprising that it's so hard to bring the Taliban down at the end of the day, considering that in terms of their arms, in terms of their equipment, they are, obviously not the superior side in this conflict?
Yes, there's a home field advantage for the Taliban and other insurgent groups like the Haqqani Network. They have the home field advantage in that they know the terrain, they know the culture, they know the people, they know who's a friendly and who's a foe, whereas any foreign force will tell you that not having the high ground when it comes to the mountains and not having as intimate knowledge of the terrain as the Taliban does is definitely going to work against you. It's not a matter of firepower and it's not a matter of technology. It's about understanding the battlefield.
To what extent is it a matter of local support from the local people, the war on the hearts and minds of the Afghan people?
The Taliban are at disseminating their brand of propaganda. They are winning the war in the information dissemination aspect. Any U.S. commander will tell you that. The U.S. and coalition forces spend millions of dollars every year trying to win hearts and minds with sponsoring radio programs and reaching out to the community with schools, community centers, projects to build canals and other public works. But the Taliban can whisper into the ear of an elder who will then on-pass their message to everyone else in the village, and that's all it takes. It's a very effective, low-tech, low-cost way of winning the support of the local populace.
What is going to happen next year?
Well, according to the Obama administration, there's going to be a significant drawdown of forces, and both combat and support forces, and that the majority of the fight will be put in the hands of special forces, Green Berets, probably Navy SEALs, and other elite military units. We'll continue with the unmanned aerial vehicles to do surveillance and to do targeted strikes. However, I believe that our presence in the country, the presence of U.S. and coalition troops will remain probably for years to come, just not in the same capacity in which they are fighting right now.
What kind of Afghanistan would they be leaving, the soldiers that will be leaving Afghanistan behind them after 10 years?
They're going to be leaving an Afghanistan that's now been living with civil war for over 30 years, a country that's been embattled for 3 decades, one in which and 2 generations now have grown up knowing nothing but war. They're leaving the country with a largely ineffective federal government that has very little reach in the rural sectors of Afghanistan. The vast majority of people in Afghanistan live in the small villages. They don't live in the major cities. And they're leaving the country possibly to be taken over by the Taliban again shortly thereafter.
Do you believe that this is what's going to happen?
I believe it's a very distinct possibility. I certainly hope it doesn't devolve into another civil war like the one they experienced after the Soviets left, in which the Taliban rose to power. However, there is that possibility. The Afghan National Security Forces are increasing their ranks, and from what I've seen, some of them are very capable fighters. Others are not. Some are. The problem, I think, is not going to be with...
Hang on, you got cut again. You said the problem?
is not going to be
Carmen, hang on. You were cut after you were saying the problem seems to be.
right. I'm starting out.
Okay.
The problem seems to be not with their abilities or with their desire. It's going to be with logistics. Whether or not the Afghan federal government is going to be able to support a large, ongoing military campaign with Afghan National Security Forces at the helm against a very persistent and patient insurgency.
Wouldn't it mean that in this sense the war has failed, in the sense of installing democracy and changing the basic values of the society in Afghanistan?
Changing the values of society, I don't think that changing the values of society should ever have been the main objective with the Afghan people. I know there's a great deal of contention in the West with some of their traditional values regarding women, regarding children, regarding punishment and what we consider to be human rights violations and cruelty. We're looking at Afghanistan through Western eyes, and that has always been problematic. If you look at the country through Western eyes, you're never going to be satisfied. You'll always consider it a failure. These are people who do not want to be Westernized, nor should they be Westernized. They have very deeply entrenched values that go back thousands of years. It's not for the U.S., for any other of the coalition countries to say this is how you should live. These are the type of people you should be. I think if the U.S. and coalition forces can keep groups like Al-Qaeda from training in Afghanistan, from planning future attacks in Afghanistan, then I think that will be a success from a Western perspective. The future of Afghanistan is up to the people of Afghanistan, and that's the way it should be.
Still, there was a lot of talk about installing democracy, about creating a different atmosphere, creating an infrastructure for a different society. Has any of this happened?
There are those within the Afghan government who work in a different capacity outside the structure of government, or what we would call corruption, who are exert a great deal of influence in other parts of the country, particularly involvement with the opium trade and other corruption rackets. However, the federal government provides services, public works, largely ineffective, unable to act as a democratic institution.
Because the pretext was to install democracy, there was a lot of activity of different NGOs in Afghanistan. I think the coalition enabled a lot of different bodies to come and work towards all sorts of things, research of democracy, trying to build democracy, building schools, teaching arts and crafts and so on. What was the contribution of these organizations to the current situation in Afghanistan? What are they going to leave behind, or are they going to stay?
The NGOs, I think the NGOs will eventually leave. They're already leaving. There's already been a significant downturn in the Afghan. Fewer.
Hang on, you're breaking. There was a significant what?
Significant downturn in the Afghan economy because a number of these organizations are leaving. Prices had skyrocketed in places like Kabul for rent and other necessities. But in recent months and the last year, prices have gone down because there aren't as many people renting office space or homes for these NGOs to do their business. I think that's going to have a very detrimental effect on the country. Excuse me. A lot of the legitimate economy, the economy outside of the opium trade, is based on foreign dollars coming in to prop up these projects. And once these projects are gone, once these NGOs are gone, the economy will largely collapse in Afghanistan.
So the prices will go down, but the economy will collapse, basically.
Yes.
Are you optimistic at all? You don't sound very optimistic about the future of Afghanistan.
It's hard to be optimistic. It really is. Again, what do you expect to see from Afghanistan? Eyes. If you're saying, I want Afghanistan to be a certain way, they should be a parliamentary democracy akin to England, or have a congressional democracy akin to the United States. That's never going to happen. That notion is ridiculous. Can Afghanistan be anything like a Western nation? No. You're lacking infrastructure, you're lacking education, you're lacking other public work, you're lacking a reliable judicial system. You don't have the basic pillars for what makes a democracy in Afghanistan. So it's not going to be a traditional democracy. Disappointment, the only disappointment will be if there is a return to a hardline Taliban leadership that supports groups like Al-Qaeda, in which they can train and plan future terror attacks. The Taliban is already showing signs of moderating their stance. They have a website, they have a spokesperson, they have a Twitter feed. Not to say that that makes them good people now, but they are definitely cognizant of the fact that they cannot be an isolated traditional hardline theocracy anymore if they want to have power. And this all comes down to power. The Islamic theology is just a thin veneer for a criminal enterprise. And I'm afraid to say that the Afghan government in itself is its own criminal enterprise. And the U.S. and coalition forces have just put their faith behind the Afghan government as one criminal enterprise fights another for the profits and future of Afghanistan.
So basically you're saying if the Taliban will basically iron their act a little bit on the religion and on the politics, but keep controlling the country and run the same criminal enterprises, they are likely to get the support of the regimes in the West at the end of the day.
Sure. Afghanistan is just a place for other people to fight. It's a war propped up by Pakistan. Pakistan doesn't want to see Afghanistan fall under the influence of India. So in one sense, it's really a fight between Pakistan and India. It's really a fight between the West and competing criminal interests in Pakistan. We just happen to be fighting in a patch of rocks called Afghanistan.
So will India start playing a more visibly prominent role in Afghanistan once the coalition leaves?
Security is going to be a great concern. India has already made bids for the country's vast iron ore resources. China has a copper interest in that country. The mineral wealth is going to be the sought-after commodity of Afghanistan. Problem is, getting to any of it is very difficult. Like I said before, no infrastructure, roads. You need to bring in heavy equipment. You need to be able to haul out anything that you mine, be it natural gas, be it iron ore, any other resources. You have to be able to get it to market, and doing so is extremely difficult in Afghanistan.
And in 10 years of coalition, none of this got any further, none of this improved in terms of the ability to mine and to get the natural resources out?
There have been hundreds of millions of dollars spent on roads and trying to improve the infrastructure of Afghanistan. There have been some successes. There have been a number of failures. There is a ring road that connects all the major cities in Afghanistan. Some of it is in terrible condition. Parts of it is subject to Taliban checkpoints and other bands of thievery that make it difficult for products to move from one place to another.
Have the opportunities that you've described attracted any Western investors except from the people who put money in security companies in Afghanistan?
Oh, there are always going to be people interested in making money.
How
wherever
are they making it? How does that work? How do they plan to make that money? What do they put the money in? Where is the Western investment in Afghanistan going?
Who's ever in control of the resources, those are the people that you need to bribe to get the contracts to make a profit. Unfortunately, in a country like Afghanistan, where there's very little transparency and a great deal of corruption, there are going to be bribes and kickbacks, and unfortunately, a lot of the money that's made off of resources in countries like this does not trickle down to the population. That's why you see countries like the one I covered in West Africa, like Nigeria, oil rich, the vast majority of the people are very poor. They call it the resource curse. There's a reason for that. This is a problem in a country like Afghanistan, where you don't have checks and balances, where you don't have a judiciary on which you can rely to keep business honest.
Also, the main natural product of the country is illegal.
That too. 90% of the world's opium comes from Afghanistan. There is a little being done to really eradicate poppy. There's poppy growing outside of U.S. combat outposts all throughout southern Afghanistan. See it all the time. Beautiful pink poppy bulbs just blooming in full effect right outside the walls of these military bases.
Is there a serious problem of drug abuse in the military, among soldiers in Afghanistan?
Among the Afghan National Security Forces with which I've spent time, they use drugs, yeah. I'm not saying they all do, but some of them do. Some of them smoke opium. A lot of them smoke marijuana. They smoke hash. And I've seen them do it on patrol. I've seen them do it while on patrol with U.S. forces through a particularly dangerous village or along a road laced with IEDs, and these guys they're smoking dope.
Has this turned into a problem among American soldiers?
No.
Or Western soldiers? No.
I haven't seen any of that, really. I know there have been isolated cases where that happens, and I'm sure it happens more than I see it, because they wouldn't do it in front of a reporter, that's for sure. But no. I think that many soldiers, U.S. and coalition troops, are pretty focused on the task, and besides, the repercussions they aren't worth the risk.
When they leave, will you leave, or will you want to stay in Afghanistan to watch what happens in the day after?
I think that once the U.S. and coalition troops leave, that's when the story is going to get really interesting. Unfortunately, a lot of news outlets have a tendency to forget about a story when troops from their particular country are no longer there. They don't feel as though they have an interest or they have a horse in that race anymore, so why cover it? However, that's going to be the really interesting time for Afghanistan, to see if the Afghan people can seize the moment and try to make a go of it as a autonomous independent state. However, there are just so many factors, so many countries operating within and manipulating the Afghan government, which is rife with corruption. They're going to have a really hard go of it, but it's going to be an interesting story, definitely.
Did you, to any extent, I suppose you did because you've stayed there for so long, fall in love with that country? So many people that I meet, English, American, Canadians, who spend many years there, seem to have some kind of fascination with this dusty place that they can't quite explain. What is it? What do you love about Afghanistan?
First and foremost, it's a beautiful country. It's amazing. The jagged peaks and the lush valleys, incredible. And you have a people there who are so hardy and so have such great resolve. I mean, they live in this place where in the summer it's 120 and in the winter it's 0 degrees, and they somehow manage to persevere through war, through disease, and it's incredible. And it's one of those stories that the more you learn about what's happening there, the more you realize that you don't know about what's going on there. Like I said, all these different competing factions who are trying to have a foothold in Afghanistan. You've got the Pakistani government, you've got the ISI, India, U.S., Britain. Everyone's got an interest in what's happening there, but nobody seems to have the concerns of the Afghan people in mind. They're the ones that are left by the wayside, and it's sad. It's disheartening to see, but at the same time, that's one of the things that compels me to keep coming back to hopefully keep telling the story, so that people know that the victims are the Afghan people for the large part. The vast majority of people have nothing to do with the Taliban. They are easily manipulated or easily controlled because they don't lack the ability to protect themselves against this small insurgency that has the backing of the Pakistani government and other criminal factions. These are the people that are forgotten in all this talk about Qurans being burned and unmanned aerial vehicle strikes, and the politics that goes on in the halls of Washington. We forget about these people that live off the land and live a day-to-day existence. I think that's what keeps me coming back.
Do you have your next story in mind? Where would you like to go?
Other than Afghanistan,
yeah.
I would like to visit Syria. The story kicked off while I was still recovering from my last injury. I would very much like to go to Syria to see what's happening there. Started my career in the Middle East. A number of my friends and colleagues have gone off to Syria, and I would like to have the opportunity to see that story firsthand. I don't think you can really get your mind around what's happening, for me, unless I'm there. I can see it and I can smell it and feel it and talk to the people and ask them, how are you being affected by what's happening here? Syria is definitely a place I would like to go. I'd also like to visit Somalia sometime. I've never been to that part of Africa. I've done work in West Africa, but Somalia is definitely another place I'd like to see. There's been talk about how there's relative stability in Somalia now. I wouldn't believe in it unless I see it for myself. It's definitely a story I'd like to tackle sometime.